Chapter 19, The Fall of the House of York, 1471–1485, by Charles Oman. All the males of the House of Lancaster had now fallen by the sword or the dagger, not only the last representatives of the elder and legitimate branch which had occupied the throne, but also the whole family of the Beauforts, the descendants of the natural sons of John of Gaunt, who had been legitimized by the grant of Richard II. Even in the female line, there remained no one who showed any signs of disputing the claim of Edward IV to the throne. The only descendants of John of Gaunt's first family who survived were the kings of Spain and Portugal, who traced themselves back to John's eldest daughter, while the Beauforts were represented by Lady Margaret Beaufort, daughter of that Duke of Somerset who had died in 1444, the elder brother of the man who lost Normandy and fell at St. Albans. The Lady Margaret had married Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the half-brother of Henry VI, and by him had a single child, Henry, now Earl of Richmond by his father's decease. In Henry, the Beaufort line had its last representative, but he was but a boy of 14 and was overseas in Brittany, whither his mother had sent him for safety, while she herself had wedded as her second spouse Lord Stanley, a peer of strong Yorkist proclivities. Neither the distant Spaniards nor the boy Henry of Richmond were seriously thought of, even by themselves, as claimants to the English crown, and King Edward might for the rest of his life repose on the laurels of Tewkesbury and Barnet, and take his ease without troubling himself about further dynastic troubles. He reigned for 12 years after his restoration in 1471, and did little that was noteworthy in that time. His love of ease gradually sapped all his energy. His life grew more and more extravagant and irregular as he sank into all the grosser forms of self-indulgence. He completely ruined a handsome person and a robust constitution, and by the age of 42 had declined into an unwieldy and bloated invalid. Edward's rule was not so bad for England as might have been expected from his very unamiable character. His second reign was comparatively free from bloodshed, if we accept one dreadful crime committed on the person of his own brother. Perhaps he deserves little praise on this score, for both the Lancastrians and the partisans of Warwick had been practically exterminated by the slaughters of 1471. It is more to his credit that he bore lightly on the nation in the matter of taxation. His pockets were full of the plunder of the House of Neville and the old Lancastrian families, and though self-indulgent, he was not a spendthrift. Indeed, he lived within his means and seldom asked for a subsidy from Parliament. This moderation, however, does not imply that he was a constitutional sovereign. He ruled through a small clique of ministers and personal dependents, mostly members of his wife's family. He disliked parliamentary control so much that he seldom summoned a parliament at all. For one whole period of 5 years, 1478–82, he was rich enough to be able to refrain from calling one together. When he did want money, however, he did not shrink from raising it in the most objectionable manner by compelling rich men to pay him forced loans called benevolences. It is fair to add that he generally paid his debts and only owed £13,000 when he died. On the whole, it may be said that his rule, though selfish and autocratic, was not oppressive. He gave the land peace in his later years, and any kind of quiet was an intense relief after the anarchy of the Wars of the Roses. Commerce and industry began slowly to rally, and the wealth of the land seems to have suffered less than might have been expected. The bloodshed and confiscations of the unhappy years between 1455 and had fallen almost entirely on the nobles and their military retainers, and the cities and the yeomen had fared comparatively well. England, PG 262, had never been left desolate like France at the end of the 100 Years' War. Edward's foreign policy was feeble and uncertain. At first, after his restoration, he intended to attack France in alliance with his brother-in-law, Charles the Rash of Burgundy, who had given him shelter and succor during his day of exile. He raised an army and crossed the Channel, talking of recovering Normandy and of asserting his right to the French crown. But Louis XI, the wily King of France, offered to buy him off, proffering him a great sum down and an annual subsidy if he would abandon the cause of Duke Charles. Edward was selfish and ungrateful enough to accept the offer with delight. He met King Louis in a formal interview at Picquigny in Picardy and bargained to retire and remain neutral for 75,000 gold crowns paid down and an annuity of 50,000 more so long as he lived. He also wrung a second zero out of Louis as a ransom for the unfortunate Queen Margaret of Anjou, a prisoner since the day of Tewkesbury, and stipulated that the Dauphin was to be married to his eldest daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, 1475. Edward came home with money in his purse and found that the French annuity, which was punctually paid him, was most useful in enabling him to avoid having to call parliaments. His betrayal of Charles of Burgundy was deeply resented by that prince, but Edward took no heed, and the Duke was slain not long after, while waging war on the Swiss and the Duke of Lorraine. 2 years after the Treaty of Picquigny occurred a tragedy, which showed that Edward could still on occasion burst out into his old fits of cruelty. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, had been received back into his favor after betraying Warwick in 1471, and had been granted half the Kingmaker's estates as the portion of his wife, Isabel Neville. But Clarence presumed on his pardon, and seems to have thought that all his treachery to his brother in 1468-70 had been forgotten as well as forgiven. He was always a turbulent, unwise, and reckless young man, and provoked the king by his insolent sayings and open disobedience. Edward had twice to interfere with him, once for illegally seizing and causing to be executed a lady whom he accused of bewitching PG 263, his wife Isabel, who died in childbirth. A second time for trying to wed, without his brother's leave, Mary of Burgundy, the heiress of Charles the Rash. When Clarence was again detected in intrigues with a foreign power, this time with Scotland, the king resolved to make an end of him. Suddenly summoning a parliament, he appeared before it and accused his brother of treason, though he gave no clear or definite account of Clarence's misdeeds. Awed by Edward's wrath and vehemence, the two houses passed a bill declaring the Duke convicted of high treason. The king then condemned him, cast him into the Tower, and there had him secretly slain, 1478. Edward for the future placed all his confidence in his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had served him faithfully all his life, had fled with him to Flanders in 1470, and had fought gallantly at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Gloucester had always been at odds with Clarence. He had married Anne Neville, the Kingmaker's younger daughter, widow of Edward, Prince of Wales, who fell at Tewkesbury. In her right he claimed half the Neville lands, but Clarence had endeavored to keep them from him and had only been compelled to disgorge them under the king's stringent pressure. After 1478, Gloucester acted as his brother's chief counselor and representative, and showed himself a very capable and zealous servant. It was Gloucester who was entrusted with the conduct of a campaign against Scotland, which was undertaken in 1482, and was the last important event of Edward's reign. This was a war not at all creditable to Edward, who intrigued with the rebellious brothers of James III, and picked a quarrel with the Scots on frivolous grounds. His real object was the recovery of Berwick, which had been in Scottish hands since Queen Margaret surrendered it in the year of Towton. Gloucester took Berwick, which after being lost for 20 years again became an English town. He also harried the Merse and Lothian, the Scots retiring before him without a battle. Soon after they made peace, ceding Berwick, and promising that their king's eldest son should marry Edward's daughter Cecily. In the year following this treaty, the king died, worn out in early middle age by his evil living and intemperance. He left PG 264 a large family, 2 sons, Edward aged 12 and Richard aged 9, and 5 daughters, of whom Elizabeth, the eldest, had reached her 18th year. The decease of Edward, though he was little regretted for himself, threw the nation into great fear and perplexity, for it was confronted with the dangerous problem of a minority, and no one knew who would succeed in grasping power as regent for the little King Edward V. It was almost inevitable that there should be a struggle for the post, for the late king's court had contained elements which were jealous of each other, and had only been kept from collision by Edward's personal influence. There were 2 persons to whom the regency might have fallen, the Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, and the late king's brother, Richard of Gloucester. Elizabeth's ascendancy implied that England would be ruled by her brothers and the sons of her first marriage, the Lords Rivers and Dorset, Sir John Grey, and Sir Edward Woodville, all uncles or half-brothers to the little Edward V. Their rule would mean the banishment or suppression of Gloucester, with whom they were already at secret feud. In the same way, the rise of Gloucester to power would certainly mean a like fall for the Woodville clan. At the moment of his accession, the young king was in Shropshire, in charge of his uncle, Earl Rivers, a fact which put the Queen's party at a great advantage. Rivers at once proceeded to bring his little nephew toward London for his coronation, guarding him with a considerable armed force. On their way, Edward and his cavalcade were encountered at Stony Stratford by Richard of Gloucester, who had also brought with him a considerable body of retainers from his Yorkshire estates. The two parties met with profuse protestations of mutual friendship and esteem, but when Rivers' suspicions were lulled to sleep, Gloucester suddenly seized him, flung him into fetters, and sent him a prisoner to the north. Rivers' fate was shared by Sir Richard Grey, the little king's half-brother, and several more of their party. Gloucester then took charge of his nephew's person and brought him up to London, where he summoned a parliament to PG 265 meet. The Queen Dowager, on hearing that her brother Rivers and her son Richard Grey were cast into prison, knew that her chance of power was gone and hastily took sanctuary at Westminster with her youngest son, the little Duke of York, and her 5 daughters. The nation was not displeased to learn that the regency would fall into the hands of Duke Richard, who was known as a good soldier and had served his brother very faithfully. It much preferred him to the Queen and her relatives, who had a bad reputation for greed and arrogance. But it soon became evident that there was something more in the air than a mere transference of the regency. Gloucester not only filled all the places about the king with his own friends, but commenced to pack London with great bodies of armed men raised on his own estates, a precaution quite unnecessary when all his enemies were crushed. He also made the Council of Regency confer gifts of money, land, and offices, on a most unprecedented scale, upon his 2 chief confidants, Henry, Duke of Buckingham, and John, Lord Howard. They were evidently being bought for some secret purpose. Gloucester and his nephew, the king, had been in London more than a month, and the day of the young king's coronation was at hand, when suddenly Duke Richard showed his real intentions by a sharp and bloody stroke. On the 13th of June, the Privy Council was meeting in the Tower of London on business of no great importance, and the Duke showed himself smooth and affable, as was his wont. After a space he withdrew, but ere long returned with a changed countenance and an aspect of gloom and anger. "What shall be done," he suddenly asked, "to them that compass the destruction of me, being so near of blood to the king and protector of this realm?" He was answered by Lord Hastings, the late king's best friend, a man of great courage and experience, who had shared in the victories of Barnet and Tewkesbury and had held the highest offices ever since. "They are worthy of death," said the unsuspicious baron, "whoever they may be." Then Gloucester burst out, "It is my brother's wife," and baring his left arm, which all men knew to be somewhat deformed since his earliest years, he cried, "Look what yonder sorceress and PG 266 Shore's wife, and those who are of their council, have done unto me with their witchcrafts." Hastings started at the mention of Shore's wife, for Jane Shore was his own mistress, and an accusation of witchcraft against her touched him nearly. "If they have so done, my lord," he faltered, "they are worthy of heinous punishment." "Answeredst thou me with ifs?" replied Duke Richard. "I tell thee they have done it, and that I will prove upon thy body, thou traitor." Then he smote upon the table, and armed men, whom he had posted without, rushed into the council chamber. Richard bade them seize Hastings, Lord Stanley, the Archbishop of York, and the Bishop of Ely, all firm and loyal friends of Edward IV. Hastings was borne out to the court of the Tower and beheaded then and there. The others were placed in bonds. This sudden blow at the young king's most faithful adherents dismayed the whole city, but Gloucester hastened to give out that he had detected Hastings and his friends in a plot against his life, and as he had hitherto been always esteemed a loyal and upright prince, his words were half believed. Richard's real object was to free himself from men whom he knew to be faithful to the young king, and unlikely to join in the dark plot which he was hatching. He next went with a great armed following to Westminster, where lay the Queen Dowager and her children. Surrounding the sanctuary with guards, and then threatening to break in if he was resisted, he sent Cardinal Berchier, the aged Archbishop of Canterbury, to persuade Elizabeth to give up her young son, Richard of York. Half in terror, half persuaded by the smooth prelate, who pledged his word that no harm should befall the boy, the Queen placed him in Berchier's hands. Richard at once sent him to join his brother in the Tower, June 16. Having both his brother's sons in his power, and having crushed his brother's faithful friends, Richard now proceeded to show his real intent. He was aiming at the crown, and had been preparing to seize it from the moment that his brother died. This was the meaning of the gifts that he had been showering around, and of the masses of armed men that he had gathered. On the 22nd of June, he laid his purpose open. His chaplain, PG 267 Dr. Shaw, was set up to preach to the people at St. Paul's Cross a marvelous sermon, in which he argued that Richard was the rightful king, though both Edward IV and Clarence, his two elder brothers, had left sons behind them. The Londoners were told to their great surprise that the late king's marriage with Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Not only had they been secretly and unlawfully married in an unconsecrated place, but Edward had been betrothed long before to Lady Eleanor Talbot, the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. He had never been given any clerical dispensation from this bond, and therefore he was not free to wed, and his sons were bastards. As to Clarence, he had been attainted, and the blood of his heir was corrupted by his father's attainder. The Londoners were astonished at this strange argument. They kept silence, and so disappointed Gloucester, who had come to the sermon in hopes to meet an enthusiastic reception. But 2 days later, a stranger scene was enacted at the Guildhall. The Duke of Buckingham, Gloucester's chief confederate, summoned together the Mayor and Council of London, and repeating all the arguments that Dr. Shaw had urged, bade them salute Richard as king. A few timid voices shouted approval, and then Buckingham declared that he recognized the assent and goodwill of the people. Next day there met the Parliament, which should have witnessed the coronation of Edward V. They were summoned to St. Paul's, where Buckingham presented to them a long document setting forth the evil government of Edward IV, denouncing his sons as bastards, and ending with a petition to Richard of Gloucester to take upon him as his right the title and estate of king. The Lords and Commons yielded their silent assent, apparently without a word of discussion or argument, and Buckingham then led a deputation to Duke Richard, who, with much feigned reluctance, assented to the petition and declared himself king. The only excuse for this lamentable weakness shown by the houses is that they were quite unprepared for the coup d'etat, and were overawed by the thousands of men-at-arms in the livery of Gloucester and Buckingham, who packed every street. So Richard was crowned with great pomp, if with little rejoicing, PG 268, and thought that he had attained the summit of his desires. But his position was from the first radically unsound. He had seized the throne so easily because his antecedents had not prepared men for such sudden and unscrupulous action, so that there had been no time to organize any opposition to him. But the pious and modest Duke had suddenly blossomed forth into a bloodthirsty tyrant. On the very day of his accession, he had the unfortunate Rivers and Grey beheaded at Pontefract, and 6 weeks later, he wrought a much darker deed. After starting on a festal progress through the Midlands, he sent back a secret mandate to London, authorizing the murder of his little nephews, Edward and Richard. They were smothered at dead of night in their prison in the Tower and secretly buried by the assassins. Their graves were never discovered when masons repairing the building came upon the bones of 2 young boys thrust away under a staircase. The murder took place between the 7th and 8th of August, 1483, but its manner and details were never certainly known. The horror which the disappearance of the harmless, unoffending young princes caused all over England was far more dangerous to Richard than their survival could possibly have been. It turned away from him the hearts of all save the most callous and ruffianly of his supporters. Within 2 months of their death, a dangerous rebellion had broken out. It was headed by Buckingham, the very man who had appeared with such shameful prominence at the time of Richard's usurpation. No one can say whether he was shocked by the murder, or whether he was merely discontented with the vast bribes that the new king had given him, and craved yet more. But we find him conspiring with the Queen's surviving kindred, the wrecks of the Lancastrian party, and some faithful adherents of Edward IV, to overturn the usurper. They proposed to call over the Earl of Richmond and to marry him to the Princess Elizabeth, the eldest sister of the murdered princes, so blending the claims of Lancaster and York, October 1483. The insurrection broke out in a dozen different districts all over England, but it was foiled by King Richard's untiring energy, PG 269, and great military talent. He smote down his enemies before they were able to unite, and caught Buckingham, who had been separated from the bulk of his fellow conspirators by a sudden rising of the Severn. The Duke was executed at Salisbury, with such of his party as were taken, but the majority escaped oversea and joined the Earl of Richmond. This was destined to be the last gleam of success that Richard was to see. The rest of his short reign, 1483–85, was a period of unrelieved gloom. No protestations of his goodwill to England, and no attempts, however honest, to introduce just and even-handed government availed him aught. He summoned a parliament in 1484 and caused it to pass several laws of excellent intention, but he was not able to observe them himself, much less to enforce them on others. After having with great solemnity abolished the custom of raising benevolences or forced loans, such as his brother Edward IV had loved, Richard was compelled by the emptiness of his treasury to have recourse to them again in less than a 12-month after he had disavowed the practice. Personal misfortunes came upon the king in a way which seemed to mark the judgment of heaven. Less than a year after he had slain his nephews, his only son Edward, Prince of Wales, died suddenly in the flower of his boyhood, 1484. 11 months later his wife, Queen Anne, the daughter of the kingmaker, followed his son to the grave. His enemies accused him of having poisoned her, for all charges were possible against one who had proved himself so cruel and treacherous. It is said that Richard thought for a moment, after his wife's death, of compelling his niece Elizabeth, Edward Roman IV's eldest daughter, to marry him in order to merge her claim to the crown in his own. But the mere rumor of the intention so shocked the people that all his own partisans urged him to disavow it, which he accordingly did. Being wifeless and childless, he nominated as his heir his nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, the son of his eldest sister. Meanwhile, the conspiracy, which had failed to overthrow Richard in the autumn of 1483, was again gathering head. The Earl of Richmond had obtained loans of men and money from PG 270 France, and was only waiting for the news that his friends were ready to make a second attempt on England. With him were all the enemies of King Richard who had escaped death: Dorset, the son of Queen Elizabeth, Edward Woodville, Morton Bishop of Ely, and the few surviving Lancastrian exiles headed by the Earls of Pembroke and Oxford. They relied not on their French soldiery, but on the secret allies who were to join them in England, and especially on Lord Stanley, the Earl of Richmond's father-in-law. That noble, though he had been arrested in company with the unfortunate Hastings, had been pardoned by King Richard and entrusted by him with much power in Lancashire and Cheshire. Richard's court was honeycombed with treason. His own Attorney General, Morgan of Kidwelly, kept Richmond informed of his plans and actions. Of all those about the king, only a very few were really faithful to him. Richard knew that treason was abroad, though he could not identify the traitors. He struck cruelly and harshly at all that he could reach. His ferocity may be gauged from the fact that he actually hung a Wiltshire gentleman named Collingbourne for no more than a copy of verses. The unfortunate rhymester had scoffed at Richard's three favourites, Lord Lovell, Sir William Catesby, and Sir Richard Ratcliffe, in the lines. The hog was Richard himself, whose favourite badge was a white boar. In August 1485, Henry of Richmond landed at Milford Haven, and was joined by many of the Welsh, among whom he was popular because of his own Welsh blood that came from his father, Edmund Tudor. Advancing into England, he met with aid from the Talbots of Shrewsbury and many other Midland gentry. Lord Stanley gathered a considerable army in Lancashire and Cheshire, but did not openly join the Earl, because his son, Lord Strange, was in the king's hands and would have been slain if Richard had been certain of his father's treachery. Advancing still further into the Midlands, Henry met the king at Bosworth Field near Leicester. Richard's army was twice the PG 271 size of that of the Earl. He must have conquered if his men had fought honestly for him. But when the battle was joined, the Earl of Northumberland, who led one wing of Richard's host, drew aside and would not fight, and presently Lord Stanley appeared with his contingent and charged the king in flank. The Yorkists began to disperse and fly, for they fought with little heart for their cruel master. But Richard himself would not turn back, though his attendants brought him his horse and besought him to save himself. He plunged into the thick of the fray, cut his way to Richmond's banner, and was there slain, fighting desperately to the last. With him fell his most faithful adherent, John Lord Howard, whom he had made Duke of Norfolk, and a few more of his chief captains. His favourite, Sir William Catesby, was taken prisoner and executed when the battle was over. Richard's crown, beaten off his helmet by hard blows, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Richmond's head by Lord Stanley, who then saluted him as king by the name of Henry VII. The dead monarch's body was taken to Leicester and exposed naked before the people, but ultimately given honourable burial in the Church of the Grey Friars. Thus ended the prince who had wrought so much evil, and won his way to power by such unscrupulous cunning and cruelty. He was only 33 when he was cut off. There have been worse kings in history, and had his title been good and his hands clean of the blood of his kinsmen, he might have filled the English throne not unworthily. But the consequences of his first fatal crime drove him deeper and deeper into wickedness, and he left a worse name behind him than any of his predecessors. The historians of the next generation drew his portrait even darker than he deserved, making him a hideous hunchback with a malignant, distorted countenance. As a matter of fact, his deformity was only that his left arm was somewhat withered, and his left shoulder consequently lower than his right. His portraits show a face not unlike that of his brother Edward, but thinner and set in a nervous and joyless look of suspicion.